So I was a really, really super, super quiet, super small, fair, shy, painfully shy, sensitive girl. And I went to this big, massive city school on the south side of Chicago. It was kindergarten through 8th grade, and it was 3 stories, big, huge brick building, and just like, it was a school, these big iron doors, and going to school was kind of scary. The classes were big, and we sat in rows and did worksheets, and school was not a fun place. It was a scary and lonely place. I had one friend, Lisa Morrow. I didn't talk. I would sometimes go for days without talking. But Lisa Morrow was my friend. Until 3rd grade. Until 3rd grade, when Mrs. Sconyers became my teacher. Mrs. Sconyers was young and pretty. And she had long hair, and she wore flowered dresses, and she let us make art, and she didn't care if we colored outside of the lines, and we wrote poetry, and she had us write novels, and a friend of hers was a publisher, and she sent our novels to her publisher friend, and her publisher friend commented on our novels, and life was good in Mrs. Sconyers' class. Oh, and she put our desks in tables, like they were tables. You know, we got to put the desks together so we got to actually look at each other. This was like 1969. And one day she brought this little this little band into class. It was 2 men and a woman, and they all wore dashikis and ponytails and flowers in their hair, and there was a guitar and a flute, and they sang songs about peace and love. And it was so cool. They were actual hippies. They were just the grooviest people, and they sang this amazing song that just rocked my 3rd grade tender poet heart. Where have all the flowers gone? Oh my God, I just loved that song so much. I thought it was so cool how the flowers went to the girl, to the boy, to the soldier, to the cemetery, and then back to the flowers. I thought that was the most amazing thing. I loved that song, and I just felt like thought Mrs. Sconyers was the coolest person on the planet to bring these hippies in to sing for us. Oh. So anyway, one day I was at my locker. I'm standing at my locker, and Derek Aguilard came up to talk to me. Not only did I not talk that much to people, I especially didn't talk to boys, and this was a boy. And he's standing there at my locker, and I'm like, what's going on? This boy is standing here talking to me. And he kind of has his head tilted, and he's got his hand, he holds his hand out towards me, and he says, oh, wait, God, I skipped a whole part. Derek Aguilard, not yet. Okay, so Mrs. Sconyers, that's a little foreshadowing. Mrs. Sconyers, saved my life. But one day I walk into my 3rd grade class, and Mrs. Sconyers is not at the front of the room. There's this, very large, old, mean-looking teacher, and she's sitting at the desk, and it's not Mrs. Sconyers. And I'm assuming it's a sub, but I look around the room, and all the desks are back in rows. And I can't figure out what's going on. And I learn that Chicago did some reassignment, and Mrs. Sconyers, the new young teacher, got bumped, and my new teacher was Mrs. Blake. And she was this big, old, scary-looking woman, and she sat in the desk. She actually taught the class sitting in her desk. She never got out of the desk. And she had this pointer, and she would point to the chalkboard, and she would scold children with her pointer. And she taught from sitting in the desk, and she wore all this makeup, and people would say that when she scratched her face, the makeup would come off, and you could see that she was actually a witch. That's what they said about Mrs. Blake. And Mrs. Blake was scary, and we had to cut out these patterns. We made these little stuffed bunnies, and they were pink bunnies, and we all used the same patterns, and all our bunnies looked the same. It was back to the dregs again. So anyway, then one day I'm standing at my locker, and Derek Aguilard walks up. And he kind of tilts his head, and I'm totally overwhelmed and confused, and I'm shaking because I don't know what's about to happen. And he says, "Johanna, Jacques Clark, he loves you. He wants to marry you." And he opened his hand, and in the palm of his hand is this wedding band and this huge rock. And it's just like glowing, and I'm just like, I don't know what to say or do. I'm too young to get married. And I don't even know this guy, and my chin starts to curl up and my forehead starts to curl up, and I just look at him, and then I run, and I want to run into the arms of Mrs. Sconyers, but Mrs. Sconyers is not my teacher anymore. So I go in, and there's Mrs. Blake, and she's sitting at her desk, and she's just... And I go up to Mrs. Blake, and it's the only thing I can do. I don't know what else to do. I have to tell somebody because I don't know how to get out of this. And I say to Mrs. Blake, "Mrs. Blake, Derek Aguilard told me that Jacques Clark wants to marry me, and he gave me a ring." And at first she doesn't really pay much attention, and there's all this commotion in the classroom. The kids are buzzing, and the day hasn't started yet, and she's just sitting there, and she's grading papers, and she's not looking at me. But then in that moment, she pounds her hands on the desk, and she stands up. She pushes the chair back, and she stands up, and the whole room starts to shake because Mrs. Blake is standing up, and I don't know what's about to happen. And Derek Aguilard and Jacques Clark walk into the class, and Mrs. Blake slams her hands on the desk, and she says, "Jacques Clark, school is a time for learning, not for loving." And everybody's quiet. And then I'm just standing there in front of the class, and she slowly sits down, and I quietly walk back to my seat, and nobody's talking, and we continue to do worksheets and make pattern bunnies, but now I know that Mrs. Blake has my back.